The painful thing about Off-White is not that people forgot it. They didn't. People still know the zip tie. They still know the quotation marks. They still know the arrows, the industrial belt, the sneakers, the hoodies, the entire visual language that Virgil Abloh built. Off-White is still one of the most recognizable brands of the streetwear era. But recognition is not the same as relevance. Off-White didn't lose power because people forgot Virgil Abloh. It started losing power because everyone remembered him too clearly. Because there was a moment when Off-White felt like it was rewriting the rules of fashion in real time. It made luxury feel younger, faster, more ironic, more connected to the way people actually dressed and consumed culture. And at the center of all of it was Virgil Abloh, not just designing clothes, but translating an entire cultural shift into fashion. But that is also what made Off-White so vulnerable. This is not a story about a brand going bankrupt overnight. This is a story about a cultural downfall. And what happened to Off-White forces every brand to eventually answer the same brutal question. Can a brand built entirely around one person's vision survive without him? To understand why Off-White's current struggle is so painful, you have to understand why it became so massive in the first place. It wasn't because the clothing was always traditionally beautiful. It was because Virgil Abloh understood where culture was going earlier than most people in luxury did. Virgil didn't come from a traditional fashion background. He had a degree in civil engineering and a master's in architecture. He looked at fashion not as a sacred art form, but as a system of communication. He understood that the old rules of luxury, exclusivity based purely on price and heritage, were breaking down. Young people were looking at fashion through the lens of sneakers, hip-hop, and collaboration culture. They wanted clothes that spoke to their reality, not to a fantasy of Parisian aristocracy. So, in 2013, he launched Off-White. And he didn't just give them clothes. He gave them a visual language. He took normal, everyday objects and recontextualized them. He put words in quotation marks, instantly making them ironic. He took the plastic zip ties you find at a hardware store and attached them to sneakers, turning them into collectible artifacts. He used diagonal hazard stripes and four-way arrows to make streetwear instantly recognizable from across the street. He turned a yellow industrial tie-down strap into a luxury belt. These codes were simple, almost aggressively basic, but they felt like insider language. When you bought an Off-White hoodie, you weren't just buying cotton. You were buying access to a cultural moment. You were proving that you understood the joke, and you were participating in a dialogue about what luxury even meant in the 21st century. It was a brilliant subversion of the entire fashion system, orchestrated by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate hype. Off-White felt like fashion, a meme, an art project, and a status symbol all crashing into each other at the exact right time. Virgil made streetwear understandable for the luxury world, and he made luxury understandable for the streetwear generation. And the industry noticed. There was even a moment right around 2017 and 2018 when Off-White wasn't following fashion. Fashion was following Off-White. The absolute peak of this cultural dominance was the 10. In 2017, Nike gave Virgil Abloh unprecedented access to their archives. He took 10 classic silhouettes, from the Air Jordan 1 to the Converse Chuck Taylor, and completely deconstructed them. He exposed the foam, added his signature zip ties, printed air and shoelaces in Helvetica, and rebuilt them. He didn't just redesign the shoes, he revealed the process of making them. It wasn't just a sneaker collaboration. It was the moment the entire fashion world realized that Virgil wasn't just placing streetwear next to luxury. He was fusing them together permanently. The hype around the 10 is almost impossible to overstate. It changed sneaker culture forever. People camped out, drops sold out, and resale prices skyrocketed into the thousands. Sotheby's even auctioned off the complete collection as if it were fine art. It proved that Virgil could take the most ubiquitous, mass-market items in the world and elevate them to the level of high luxury simply by applying his specific design philosophy. And it pushed Off-White into the stratosphere. According to the List Index, which tracks global fashion search and shopping data, Off-White was officially named the hottest brand on the planet in 2018. Over an 18-quarter period, Off-White took the #1 spot 5 different times. They were beating Gucci, they were beating Balenciaga, and they were beating Prada. This wasn't niche hype. This was global, undeniable dominance. Off-White became the uniform of celebrity culture. Everyone from Rihanna to A$AP Rocky to Serena Williams was wearing it. But the critical thing to remember is that Off-White was always vulnerable. Because it leaned so heavily on timing, context, and hype, it was tied to a very specific era. What feels incredibly fresh and subversive in 2017 can very quickly feel like the uniform of a bygone moment if it doesn't evolve. But in 2021, the biggest player in luxury decided to bet the house on Virgil's future. In July 2021, LVMH, the conglomerate that owns Louis Vuitton and Dior, announced they were acquiring a 60% majority stake in Off-White. Virgil retained 40% and remained the creative director. This was the ultimate business validation. Virgil was already the artistic director of Louis Vuitton menswear, but this deal was different. Reuters reported that the acquisition was meant to expand LVMH's relationship with Virgil across multiple categories, potentially including hotels, wine, and spirits. It was a signal that LVMH didn't just view Virgil as a fashion designer, they viewed him as a visionary who could reshape their entire portfolio of brands. Vogue described it as LVMH's big bet on Virgil. They weren't just buying a streetwear brand. They were buying access to Virgil's cultural instinct, his direct line to Gen Z, to digital culture, and to new business models. They saw him as the architect of modern luxury. But this massive corporate bet also exposed a structural risk that no one wanted to say out loud. The entire financial value of Off-White depended on one man's ability to continuously generate cultural relevance. Take him out of the equation, and the business case started to look very different. What nobody outside his inner circle knew at the time was that Virgil had already been privately battling cardiac angiosarcoma since 2019. He chose to keep his diagnosis completely hidden, continuing to work across every role he held while undergoing treatment. He signed the biggest deal of his career while fighting for his life. 4 months later, that equation changed forever. On November 28, 2021, the fashion world stopped. Virgil Abloh passed away at the age of 41 after a private 2-year battle with a rare and aggressive form of cancer.
Virgil Abloh, at just 41 years...
The shock and grief across the industry were profound. He was at the absolute peak of his powers, and his sudden absence left a massive void in the center of the fashion universe. And behind the scenes, Off-White was left with an almost impossible problem. They were not a heritage house with 100 years of archives and established codes like Chanel or Dior. The code was Virgil. His taste, his timing, his network, his humor, his references, his relentless tempo. He was the engine that powered the entire machine. How do you continue a brand when the person who made it make sense is gone? If you stick too closely to Virgil's original designs, the brand becomes a museum, a tribute act frozen in time. But if you move too far away from his vision, it stops feeling like Off-White entirely. It loses the very essence that made it special. This is the impossible inheritance that fell to I.B. Kamara. Kamara is an incredibly talented stylist and editor with a resume that includes Beyoncé, Rihanna, and British Vogue. He was named Art and Image Director at Off-White in 2022, then officially appointed Creative Director in February 2024. His debut collection as full creative director, Duty Free, for spring 2025, was a genuine statement of intent, merging his own Sierra Leonean and London identity with Virgil's Ghanaian roots, funneling both through a New York sportswear lens and introducing new cultural symbols alongside Off-White's signature arrow motifs. Critics respected the ambition and the personal vision behind it, but it didn't recreate the cultural urgency that Off-White once generated almost effortlessly. The shows felt meaningful, but the moment didn't feel the same. Kamara didn't inherit a normal brand. He inherited a legacy, a grieving community, massive corporate expectations, and a mythology. Every single piece he designed was automatically compared to a man who was no longer there to defend his own work. It is a deeply unfair position for any designer to be in. But the truth is, even if Virgil had lived, Off-White was about to face a massive cultural headwind. The tragedy of Off-White is not that it disappeared. The tragedy is that its codes were still visible everywhere, but they no longer felt like the future. While Off-White was trying to figure out its identity without its founder, the broader fashion market was shifting violently. The era of loud, logo-heavy streetwear was ending. Consumers were exhausted by the relentless cycle of hype and sneaker drops. The cultural pendulum swung toward quiet luxury. People wanted the restrained tailoring of the Row, the weird minimalism of Miu Miu, and old money aesthetics. They wanted clothes that whispered rather than clothes that screamed. Off-White was hit twice. It lost Virgil, and it lost the cultural wave it had been surfing on. The very aesthetic that had made the brand so dominant was suddenly out of step with what consumers actually wanted to buy. The symbols that once felt so charged with meaning, the quotation marks, the zip ties, the arrows, started to feel like merchandise from a memory. Not because they were suddenly worthless, but because the cultural tension around them had evaporated. They were no longer subversive, they were just logos. A brand that once seemed to predict the future of luxury began to feel like it was forced to constantly sell its own past. You could see the impact in the retail footprint. By late 2024, Jing Daily reported that Off-White had closed its last remaining store in mainland China, shuttering locations in Chengdu, Shanghai, Beijing, and finally, Hangzhou. The massive global expansion that had characterized the brand's peak was suddenly reversing. And then came the climax that made the downfall feel painfully real. On September 30th, 2024, exactly on what would have been Virgil Abloh's 44th birthday, LVMH announced they had sold Off-White to Blue Star Alliance. Blue Star Alliance is a New York-based brand management company. Their portfolio includes mall brands like Scotch and Soda, BB, and Hurley. They are known for acquiring distressed or declining brands and licensing their names to generate revenue. For a brand that was once the undisputed hottest label on the planet, being sold to a brand management firm felt like a brutal, symbolic end of an era. To the fashion world, it looked like a brutal sign that the magic had become harder to protect. It doesn't mean Blue Star will automatically kill the brand. Off-White is still operating under a licensing agreement with New Guards Group until 2026, and there is still hope for a reset. The brand still has a massive global following and a deeply passionate community. But the perception is undeniable. The sale proved that the biggest luxury conglomerate in the world simply did not know how to translate Virgil's cultural energy into a stable, long-term brand without him. They realized that without the founder, the brand was just a collection of trademarks, and they chose not to keep fighting for it inside the group. Off-White's real tragedy is not what happened to the brand. It's what happened around it. Virgil Abloh helped build the future of fashion, a world where streetwear and luxury spoke the same language, where a kid with an architecture degree could rewrite the rules of Paris. And that future arrived. It's everywhere now. His brand just didn't make it there with him. Off-White may still exist, it may still sell sneakers and hoodies. It may even find a new path forward under its new ownership. But without Virgil, it has been forced to answer the one brutal question that every founder-led brand eventually faces. Was this a house with a future, or was it just a monument to a moment? Can Off-White ever become a living, breathing brand again, or will it remain a perfectly preserved language from the Virgil Abloh era? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.